mean, I wish in some ways that you could defeat terrorists with nuclear submarines, because we have a lot of nuclear submarines. They don't have any. It would be over. It's just irrelevant. The great bulk of our military expenditure is wholly irrelevant to the war against terrorism.
Acknowledge that at the state and local level, we are hurting of the people.
Cut military spending and move it to jobs and services in our communities.
Coming up on
This is a program entitled Fund Our Communities Not War, sponsored by Newton Dialogues on Peace and War. And I'd like to thank our Mass Peace Action, Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Boston chapter, and the Newton Highlands Neighborhood Area Council. So on behalf of all of these groups, it's very nice to see you on such a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I'd also like to thank the St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and Margaret Hummel, the warden of the church, would like to welcome all of you as well.
Welcome you all, and say that I feel privileged that you're using our space this afternoon.
Yes, so thank you to the church for allowing us to use this beautiful hall. Now, this program has been inspired by the twin crises that we face in the world today. And we are in the midst, despite some good news in recent months, of the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We still have very significant unemployment. We still have serious investment needs in this country which are not being met. In Newton alone, infrastructure of the city, schools, government buildings, etc. And we have a shortage of funds for all of these things. At the same time, we've been engaged in the Afghan war since the longest war in US history. There's been a tremendous increase in military spending at this moment when there's no money for so many of our basic needs. And to address this crisis, we have three very eminent figures gathered here on either side of me to talk about possible solutions. I will introduce them, but before I introduce them, I would like to first recognize Dick Blazer and Ted Hess-Mahan, who are also elected officials, aldermen who are in the audience, and thank you for joining us here. Our first speaker will be Ruth Balzer, who I'm sure many of you know. She's in her 7th term as our representative in the State House. And I described her just a few minutes ago as a fierce fighter for state support for many of our social needs. And it's wonderful to have her in Beacon Hill on our side. She will be speaking first. She will be followed by Michael Prokosh, who is from Dorchester, a member of Dorchester People for Peace, and also the national coordinator for the New Priorities Network, which is working at the national level to move our money out of the military into meeting our social and community needs. He's our second speaker, and our final speaker is Congressman Barney Frank, who has been a member of Congress since 1980, and to my great dismay, is retiring at the end of this year. So that is please sign up. On the back table, there are sheets. So without further ado, let me hand over the mic to Representative.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. We have with us today the national leader on the issue of reducing military spending and reinvesting in America. And I know you're all eager to hear from him. So We will be brief, but we were asked to join the panel today so that just to acknowledge that at the state and local level, we are hurting. We do not have the resources to meet the people of Newton, of Massachusetts, of the United States. Of the state budget, we have been struggling these last years during this worst recession, this worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. It's hit us hard. Actually, leadership of people like the congressman and, of course, others, and the president. But let me talk a little bit about, what those cuts have meant. I mean, there have been in these years deep cuts at every level of state government. For the past 4 years, deep cuts to local aid, to education, to healthcare, to human services, to public safety, to the environment, to our parks. Let me talk first about local aid, because this has even hurt us here in Newton, although we're one of the more fortunate communities on the planet. Nonetheless, this downturn has hurt us significantly as well. General local aid has been cut 36% over this period of time. Now, that cut impacts the lower income communities far worse than it does communities like our own, as they depend. A greater part of their budget is dependent on state aid, but nonetheless, this has hurt Newton. All across our state, we've had police and firefighters and teachers lay cuts, $440 million in cuts to Chapter 70, our education aid, $100 million in cuts, that's 17%, to early education and care. We're talking about child care subsidies, diminishing pre-kindergarten programs, early childhood. In particular hits Newton was that we at the state level were in the midst of a 5-year program to increase the percentage of our foundation, our education foundation budget that we would give to communities like Newton. Actually the higher end communities, which get very little state aid for education, but given the limits of Proposition 2.5, we very much need that state aid. We were in the middle of a 5-year progression of bringing that percentage up. That got frozen in the middle of the crisis. Newton has not had the opportunity of that increase to our school budget that we're still waiting for. We've done a good job here in Massachusetts on health care. I'm proud to have been part of the legislature that voted for universal health care that set the model for the nation. We have the lowest rate of uninsurance in the country. Nonetheless, we've had to cut back on health care because of the fiscal crisis. Adult dental was eliminated from Mass Health. Legal immigrants lost their health insurance program, although thanks to the wisdom of the Supreme Judicial Court, that's going to be fixed. I voted, by the way, the amendment that would have restored it. We've done a good job of making our commitment to health So we've shifted to maintain our commitment to health care. We've shifted out of human services. We've had deep cuts to mental health, to public health, to programs for disabled people. Last year's budget, we cut $60 million to higher education. Every time there's a fiscal crisis, we whack the state universities. The reason we do that is because they have the opportunity to raise tuition and fees, which other public services don't, but what that also means, we're pricing out our working class and poor students from their way out of poverty and into the middle class by making it prohibitively expensive to go to our higher education. We reduced the clothing allowance for children on assistance last year. This year's budget, we're facing a $1.3 billion gap. New revenue is off the table. In this political climate, we've exhausted the federal funds that came to us with the stimulus money, and we're just going to be cutting deeply into services that people depend on. And on top of that, we have a huge, as you know, crisis in our transportation system. We've got the T has the biggest debt. The T is threatening deep reductions in services as well as increases in fares. We've got a crisis. There are many of us who want to get the conversation going around gas tax. I know there's probably support for that in this room. We are still in a minority in the state that feel that way. So the punchline to all this is that we really do need Congressman Frank to convince the national government, as he has been leading the charge for so many years, to reduce military spending and reinvest in our basic services. And I will just end by saying I, too, cannot believe that there's going to be a United States Congress without Barney Frank, and let me just personally thank him for everything he's always done for us.
And coming from Dorchester, I have to echo everything that Ruth said about how destructive the state budget cuts are and how hard they're hitting our communities. This is actually a very well-timed forum today for three reasons. One is that its budget, state budget and local budgets are about to sort of come out into the public, and people, again, are going to start seeing the cost of the economic crash, of the tax cuts for the rich and corporations, and of unbridled military spending. So this is a very good time to start connecting and start linking the services that we're not getting, the T that needs to be funded, with the lack of federal aid that we urgently need in our communities, in our cities. For cutting military spending, and the military-industrial complex, or the military-industrial congressional complex, Eisenhower's original name for it, is pushing back very hard against cutting anything further from the military budget. They've barely been nicked so far, and they're saying that the cuts already have been very serious, and that any more will destroy our security and leave us defenseless for generations to come. And the third is that it's just about 3 years since Congressman Frank, of organizing to cut military spending and move it to jobs and services in our communities by, out of the blue, as far as we knew, calling for about 25% in military spending, without which, he said, social needs could never be met. And many of us took up that call. So Barney, I don't think you know everything that we've done since then to, kind of realize that vision. So let me take a few minutes to lay that out. In Boston and in kind of up and down the eastern seaboard, there are 25% committees calling for a 25% reduction in military spending. We've started a national network of peace organizations, social justice groups, community organizing outfits, and local organizations which have passed city council resolutions in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Others are on the book, in process for Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and other cities. And smaller cities like Durham, North Carolina, and Durham County, Charlottesville, Virginia, Des Moines, Binghamton, New York. The National Council of Mayors passed a resolution last year calling for ending the wars and bringing our war money home. There are extremely strong organizing efforts going on in places like Montgomery County, Maryland, where a 50-member coalition has been formed, strongly supported by labor unions, the NAACP, immigrant organizations. They introduced a letter in the state legislature calling for moving money to state needs from the military budget. And the same happened in North Carolina, where a very talented organizer is organizing the level of the Democratic, passing resolution after resolution. Fall. And I could go on and on describing brilliant organizing that's happening in different parts of the country, including here in Boston, where communities of color have really stepped up to the plate and are starting to make cut military spending a part of campaigns like the campaign to fully fund the MBTA. And there's a leaflet out saying for the cost of about half of one Ford-class aircraft carrier, we could fund the T, take away its entire debt. Or this year's budget crisis could be funded by not building one F-35B jet fighter. So people are making the connections and they're inserting them pushbacks against the austerity program that is being created fundamentally by unnecessary tax cuts and by runaway military spending. So there's really something for everyone in this room to do. Actually, if we could circulate those sign-up sheets now so that everyone has a chance before leaving to pitch in, that would be a very good idea. What we really need to do at this point is to continue to connect the dots and continue to organize for a long-term push. The reason that we are putting so much effort into local initiatives like city council resolutions and the formation of coalitions is the power that we're up against. A lobbying force that has representation, strong representation in practically every congressional district in the country, that's been growing for 60 years, that has kind of a built-in lobbying machine that's ramping up in a way now that we haven't seen for quite a while. And that is going to take an enormous amount of tenacity. It's going to take lasting power. This is not going to be over in a week or a month. This is going to be a work of years, really. So we have to organize in a way that lasts. And the way to do that is to organize at the local level where people are more involved in their government, where the cuts hurt more, where they care more about the services that are delivered. We have to build coalitions and involve people who are not in the peace movement in this work if we're going to win. And that's our long-term organizing strategy. And I would urge everyone in the room to take a piece of that. Take this campaign back to because it affects everyone. It affects all of us. But there's work to do at other levels too. And a fundamental piece of this is connecting local power building to national decision making. We're trying to build power where we can sustain it and build it at the local level. How do we actually cut military spending and move it to our communities, which is not a given once military spending is cut. So there are jobs for Ruth and Barney, including barriers is convincing elected leaders, and for that matter, leaders of advocacy groups and service organizations, that this is not a peace movement fantasy, that this is actually a practical program that can be carried out. We need advocates inside our city councils, our boards of aldermen, our state legislatures, and in Congress, convincing fellow members that this is something to get behind, that this is going to pay off. And we need to be telling them the same thing, and we need to be telling them that through the institutions and organizations we belong to, and we basically need to keep up this drumbeat over a protracted period of time. That's really, I think, the task that is facing us. This year is going to be particularly critical. There's an enormous amount of noise going on about military spending, which we can counter by getting into our local newspapers, with letters to the editor and op-eds and every other way, by being visible in our call for cutting military spending, doing standouts, doing public events. Over time, making it a given that cutting military spending is regarded as part of the solution that elected officials and institutional leaders are bringing up when they're talking about restoring the jobs and the programs that we need. Thank you.
we face a much better political climate than when we started. And I am really gratified to realize that the joint efforts of so many of us were there, including a group of people who answered a request to put together an alternative budget. We call it task force, because it was important that we not simply say we wanted to cut, but that we show what we meant. And that has gained a great deal of credibility for us. What's transformed this situation, well, I think a couple of things have transformed the situation, because I want to be optimistic at the outset. Those of us who favor substantial reduction from the current level of military spending, I believe, are in the majority in the country for a variety of reasons. First is the importance of dealing with the long-term deficit reduction. And there isn't any question that that's important. Short-term cutbacks have been a great mistake. As people like Ben Bernanke have pointed out, Paul Krugman has been very good about this in the New York Times. But what we need is a longer-term plan for deficit reduction. And essentially, by there are going to be constraints on spending in a number of domestic programs. There are three items that we can use to bring about significant long-term deficit reduction. We can raise taxes on wealthy people, we can reduce the military, or we could make substantial reductions in the benefits that recipients of Medicare and Social Security receive. Those are the three major choices. And what that has done is allow us to make the point that many of us believed but had a harder time establishing. It's a zero-sum game. There is just no question. Oh, by the way, I used to talk about Social Security and Medicare, and I overstated that. Every other domestic program will get cut very badly. The problem, of course, is there isn't a lot of money in those the way we have done it. But I should restate it this way. In addition to tax increases is one way. The other choice is between reducing military spending or making very substantial reductions in virtually everything we do as a people together through government to improve the quality of our lives, whether that's to help people in need or to improve the quality of our lives in general. For years, we would argue that. That's now a fact of life. People accept that. That's also helped me deal with one issue that I would have when I have talked, as I have for many years, about this. I would encounter people in various groups, people who were for low-income housing, people who wanted more public transportation, people who wanted more research on illness, people who wanted to help the disabled. In every case, I would be told, well, what would be the cut that the group I advocate for would get if you cut military spending? And I would say, I can't be sure, and it's a two-step process. And the answer often was, well, we can't motivate our people. We can't motivate them to be for these cuts in general. And it was hard to get across to people that reducing military spending was a necessary condition for increasing spending on everything else, even though it wasn't sufficient. Again, that's gone. I think we now have a widespread recognition of that. And I'll tell you how I encounter the difference. I receive a steady stream of people who want to see the federal government spend more, and I usually agree with them. I do have some differences with the people who want to colonize Mars, but while I differ with them, I generally agree with them. For years I have said, and by the way, if you want more money for Alzheimer's research, if you want more military spending, and the answer was almost always, oh, well, that's not our issue. We agree with you, but it's not our issue. And my answer was, as long as it's not your issue, we will never get anything else. That's now changed. The Mass Hospital Association has now put out a resolution about cutting, and that's the work that Paul was talking about, that people now understand this. So let me give one action plan very repetitively. Any organization that you belong to that advocates for increased federal spending in a particular disease, in a particular quality of life issue, in a particular area to improve the lot of people who are hurting, please add to that group's asks a reduction in military spending. Do not go to any members of Congress and say, we need more money for cancer, and by the way, you can get it, without saying, and by the way, get it from pulling out of Afghanistan. Because what would happen in the past, of course, is people would go and talk about all these worthy causes, and they would get yes to death by people who said, oh, I very much agree with you, but would then vote for budgets that didn't allow it. So we shouldn't have a hard time now because the facts are so overwhelmingly there. Integrate a request for military spending reductions into any request you make for increases. I know for some here and some of your colleagues, this immersion into fiscal responsibility may be a little chilling at first, like very cold water. It's not what many of us are used to. I understand that. But it has won the, because we do have a deficit long term that we have to begin to bring down. And two, it is politically very important. Absent that, the advocacy doesn't go anywhere. By the way, the cost of this excessive military spending is not just on particular issues, highways and better treatment for the sick. The cuts have had a negative effect on our economy. And again, this is something that people are just now